Alexander. We left off last time with Alexander fighting the Persian Empire. And at one point he fought at a place called Megiddo. We also call it Armageddon. Armageddon is a place where there's no room for flanking maneuvers. Alexander arranged his army to where if he had to retreat, he'd retreat toward Persia. The Persians had to retreat, they'd retreat toward Macedonia. In other words, he was making sure that whoever lost was going to lose really badly. And whoever won would have a huge advantage. He kept chasing the Persian king Darius III. He never caught Darius III. He did catch his family, but he gave his wife, Darius' wife, and family back to him. Eventually, Darius was killed by some of his own men. Alexander had not wanted Darius III killed, wanted him alive, but nevertheless, Darius was killed. Alexander went on to conquer Tyre. He conquered Egypt, then went on and moved into the region between the Tigris and Euphrates, the Mesopotamian region. And from there he branched out, moving ever eastward toward the rising sun. We might sometimes wonder, why didn't he go to Rome, which was closer? For one thing, Persia was a more established empire. But for another, there are stories that he was heading toward the rising sun because his horse was afraid of his shadow, and if he could mount a horse in the morning and head east, his horse would not see his shadow. Be that as it may, also some authors have said he was looking for the end of the world, and they knew where the end of the world was over here, but his people had no idea where the end of the world was over here. And I haven't seen that in any recent history books. I don't know why the history books anymore leave that out, but 40 to 50 years ago, history books said he was looking for the end of the world. Obviously unaware of the big Indian subcontinent or of the China, the vast Chinese domains. Anyway, he went to India, conquered the defeated Indian army, conquered some Indian territory, mostly what we today call Pakistan. And I've told you already about how that one of his followers was an Indian man named Chandragupta Maurya, who set up an empire after he left. But somewhere in India he was wounded. Any history book will tell you he was wounded by an arrow. But he had never been wounded before, but he was wounded badly. And shortly afterward, his men, to a man, from the generals to the privates in his army, simply said, no, we are not going to march any farther. We're not going to fight anymore. We're going home. And even Alexander had to yield to the unanimous decision of his army. He started on the march back home, still suffering from his wound. Stopped in Babylon for a while. Developed a fever, according to the story that we've been told. Some say he died in a drunken stupor. Died in Babylon, still quite young, age of 32. He had ruled for 12 years. When he died, his generals split the empire into four. Now, for a while, they tried to hold together, but eventually there was friction among them. At first, his son was crowned. He had one son who was still a boy of about 7 or 8 years old, quite young. The boy was crowned, but then eventually the boy was killed, along with his mother, Alexander's wife. And the empire was divided into four sections. The two I want you to remember was the Seleucids and the Ptolemies. These people took Egypt, and these took Syria, as far as India. In other words, the Seleucids started off from here, Syria, and got most of what was the old Persian Empire. They found it difficult to hold, though. And then the Ptolemies of Egypt. Now, these Ptolemies of Egypt and Seleucids fought each other. And Israel was caught right in the middle, tiny little Judea, caught in the middle. And oftentimes suffered terribly as the fortunes of war went first one way and another. It's almost as though the Jews found themselves fighting on the losing side almost every time. Now, eventually, they decided to fight for themselves rather than fight for one of these two. Keep the Ptolemies of Egypt in mind. Some of them became great astronomers and studied the stars and cataloged what we knew about the ancient astronomy. And the last of the Ptolemies was a woman named Cleopatra, who married Julius Caesar, which we'll talk about in the next chapter, whom we'll talk about in the next chapter. Anyway, Alexander, his main legacy was that he gave rise to the Hellenistic world, which followed. The book spends several paragraphs talking about the question, was Alexander great? Be that as it may, he changed the course of Western history. He spread Greek culture, or the Greek language, Greek art, until Greek became the language of much of the Eastern Mediterranean world. So much so that the New Testament was written in Greek. Greek became like a standard language in our culture, a standard culture that helped give this part of the world some sense of unity, which made it easier for the Romans who came later to adopt Greek culture themselves. And with a common culture, the Roman Empire was able to hold together for about 1,000 years. All right. I want to skip over to, let's see. I mean, it's not that this other stuff is not important. I mean, but thanks in part to Alexander, these people began trading with each other. And again, I can't emphasize how important trade is. They also spent some time fighting each other. Women began to advance somewhat. They had been looked down on by the Greeks, but under Alexander, they made some strides, began to move forward. In spite of the opinions of philosophers that they should remain at home and should remain childbearers and homemakers, they began to advance anyway. Science also advanced, particularly the science of astronomy. Now, in your study of the history of science, up until about the 16 or 1700s, the science of astronomy was the most advanced science by modern standards that we have. In terms of, well, it was observation and cataloging. They cataloged the movements of the planets, which we still have today, and we've determined that the planets have kept pretty much the same pattern from that time till this. They were able to predict eclipses, able to predict when Venus was going to pass in front of the sun, and that's something that happened just a few years ago here, and those of you who happened to be here at the time might have seen it on the telescope here on campus. It's something that only happens once every 150 or so years, but it's happened in our lifetime. I did not get to see it. I just assumed it was going to be cloudy that day, but the clouds rolled back long enough for the persons here to get a view of it, but I did see it in pictures only. Euclid, here's a few names I remember. Euclid established a school for the entire for geometry. If you take a course in geometry, you will definitely study Euclid, where you have your basic assumptions, one of them being the shortest distance between any two points is a straight line. If you have, and triangles, if you know two sides of a triangle and one angle, you can figure out the rest of the dimensions of the triangle, which is how we're able to measure the distances between planets and the distance of stars, thanks in large part to the work of Euclid. They figured out the mathematical concept of pi. Again, in your geometry classes, you'll always run into this number, 3.141592654, I believe. I memorized the first digits, the first several digits many years ago. Not that it's been that important to me, but pi will carry out, when I was a kid, they told us it carried out to 3,000 decimal places, but then they got computers involved. They've carried it out to millions of decimal places. It never repeats itself and never ends. This goes on and on and on. But they figured it out to about the third decimal point, accurately figured it out, which is somewhat difficult to do unless you have really accurate ways of measuring. One of them is an astronomer named Aristarchus, and I mean, regrettably, folk, I would have to tell you, I did make up the test and left out Aristarchus' name, so don't worry about it so much. I must mention, though, he said that the sun was the center of the universe and not the earth. Later on, Copernicus was a copy of him. Both Copernicus and Aristarchus were slightly wrong. The sun may be the gravitational center of the solar system, but neither the earth or the sun are looked on as the center of the universe today. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek. The ancients believed that the earth was the center of the universe. Then we got a bit more knowledge and figured out, well, hey, looks like the earth goes around the sun, so the sun is the center. Then we developed telescopes and discovered that the universe consists of many, many galaxies, of which our own Milky Way galaxy is a small part. But then we got even more knowledgeable and trying to figure out where the center of the universe is. Now, folks, you can argue if you want to, but some astronomers today actually are going back to the idea that our own Milky Way galaxy is actually the center of the universe. That everywhere you look in all directions, up, down, sideways, east, west, whatever, it appears the universe is expanding outward, away from us, away from the earth, away from the solar system, away from the Milky Way galaxy. Again, I had a student a couple of semesters ago argue with that. You can if you want to. You can. Someone else pointed out that perhaps anywhere you stand in the universe, you're always going to think there's a center. That might be true or might not. But we have not really discovered any other center of the universe except for the earth that we're standing on.